The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it was written in the hand of a man who had forgotten how to want anything. Elias Boone sat alone at the rough-hewn table in the center of his ranch house, a single oil lamp throwing weak golden light across the walls, and he stared at the blank paper for a long time before he wrote a single word. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the valley like something searching for a way in. Inside, the house was so quiet that the scratch of his pen against the paper sounded almost violent. He was not writing a love letter. He had made his peace with the fact that love was something that belonged to a different version of himself, a younger man, a softer man, a man who had not yet learned what it cost to open yourself completely to another person, only to watch the world take them away. He wrote his requirements the way a man writes a list of supplies before a long journey. A woman between 25 and 35, strong enough for frontier work, capable of surviving winters that came like punishment and stayed like grief. Quiet, practical, no city foolishness, no expectations beyond what the land required. He sealed the envelope without reading it back, rode 12 miles to the nearest mail post in the gray morning cold, handed it to the clerk without making eye contact, and turned his horse back toward Black Creek Valley without a second thought. That was the spring of 1853. He told himself it was a practical decision, the same as buying a new plow or reinforcing the barn roof before winter. He told himself he felt nothing about it either way. He was almost convincing. Elias Boone had come west after Shiloh with a horse, a bedroll, and a silence so deep inside him that most people who met him assumed it was simply his nature. It was not his nature. It was what the war had made of his nature. He had watched men die in fields that smelled like gunpowder and wet earth, and he had carried that smell home with him to Tennessee and found that the world had continued turning without any awareness of what he had seen. So he went farther west into the raw, open territory where the land was enormous and asked nothing of a man except endurance. And for a long time, that was enough. He built his 200 acres outside Black Creek slowly, with his own hands, fence post by fence post, season by season. He married Clara in the spring of 1848. She had brown eyes and a laugh that carried across the open fields on quiet mornings, and she had a way of making the ranch house feel inhabited, alive, full of the particular warmth that only certain people carry with them everywhere they go. She gave him a daughter, Lucy, in the autumn of 1849, and for 2 years Elias Boone was something he had not been since before the war. He was happy. Then the fever came in the winter of 1851 and took Clara in 9 days. 9 days. He had counted them afterward, in the terrible silence that followed, the way a man counts the steps back from a place he can never return to. After Clara died, something inside Elias did not break. It closed, quietly, completely, the way a door closes in a house where no one is left to open it again. He worked from before sunrise until long after dark. He fed the cattle and mended the fences and cooked simple, flavorless meals and ate them standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting at the table alone felt like a cruelty he had not yet learned to absorb. Little Lucy, who had been 4 years old when her mother was buried, grew up inside that silence. She became a watchful child, small and careful, with her mother's brown eyes and a habit of observing everything from a safe distance, as though she had learned early that the world could change without warning, and the wisest thing was to stay very still and pay close attention. The townspeople of Black Creek respected Elias. They called him steady, dependable, a man you could count on in a hard season. But not one of them truly knew him, because Elias had decided in the long, dark months after Sarah's death that he would survive and he would work and he would raise his daughter, but he would not feel anything deeply again. Feeling deeply was simply another name for something that could be taken from you. So the letter to St. Louis was not weakness, it was not longing, it was maintenance, nothing more. By late summer, the reply came. A woman had been found. Her name was Clara Whitmore, 32 years old. The letter from the matrimonial office described her as capable, educated, and accustomed to hard work. It said nothing about the fact that she had sharp eyes that missed nothing, or that she carried herself with the particular dignity of someone who had survived something significant and intended never to be diminished again. Elias drove the wagon to meet the stagecoach on a bright September morning, with the mountains sitting blue and enormous behind the valley. He stood beside the wagon holding his hat in both hands and watched the passengers step down into the dust. And then Clara Whitmore stepped down. She was tall, dark-haired, wearing a deep green traveling coat that was dusty from the long road, but still somehow formal, as though she had packed it specifically to remind herself that she came from a place with standards. She carried 2 leather bags and a wooden box tied carefully with rope, and she moved with the quiet, deliberate ease of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for anyone to help her. She looked around at the raw, wind-swept landscape with those calm, measuring eyes. Then she looked at Elias. He looked at her. A long moment passed between them, the kind of moment that contains more information than most conversations. Then Clara said, without warmth but without cruelty, "You looked kinder in your description." Elias opened his mouth, closed it. In 31 years of living, through a war and a marriage and a grief and a decade of frontier isolation, no one had ever spoken to him within the first 10 seconds of meeting him. He had absolutely no idea what to do with it. He put his hat on, loaded her bags into the wagon, and they set off toward the ranch without another word. For the first 3 miles, the silence between them was the kind that 2 strangers share without discomfort. Then Clara began asking questions. How far to the nearest doctor? Did the well run clean year-round? What kind of winters did this valley see? Why were the fence posts along the south pasture leaning at that angle? Did Lucy receive any schooling? Was there a church within reasonable distance? Elias answered each question in the fewest possible words. Yes, mostly, hard, flooding last spring, some, 15 miles. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the land roll past. Then she said evenly and without apology, "You speak like a man who believes silence is the same thing as strength." Elias said nothing. He understood immediately, and with a discomfort that surprised him, that she was not entirely wrong. What Elias did not know, what no letter had mentioned because Clara had chosen not to mention it, was that she had not come west in search of a husband. She had come because remaining in Missouri would have completed the destruction of her. 2 years before she answered the advertisement, Clara had been engaged to a schoolteacher named Thomas Aldridge. He was a gentle, bookish man who read poetry aloud on Sunday afternoons and believed sincerely in the essential goodness of ordinary life. 6 weeks before their wedding, he was thrown from a horse on a muddy road outside of town and did not survive the night. Clara had sat beside him until the end, holding his hand in both of hers, watching the light go out of his eyes with a steadiness that she paid for in the months that followed. She walked home alone in the dark that night and sat in her kitchen until the sun came up because she could think of a single reason to go to sleep. The grief that followed was not the kind that announces itself dramatically. It was the quiet, grinding kind that settles into the bones and makes every ordinary moment feel like an act of endurance. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of a piano through a neighbor's window, the particular quality of late afternoon light in autumn, which had been Thomas's favorite season. She survived it through pure, stubborn will and the refusal to let it finish her. But she survived it entirely alone, and the loneliness of that survival, the knowledge that grief shared is grief halved, and that she had no one to share it with, had left her permanently careful, permanently self-contained. So when she stepped off that stagecoach in Wyoming Territory, she had made herself one promise: she would work, she would be useful, she would build something from nothing in a place where no one knew her story, but she would not become invisible. She would not surrender herself to a man's practical expectations and slowly disappear into the background of someone else's life. She would not do that. Not again. Not ever.
The first week at the ranch was quiet and careful, the way the first week between two wary people always is. Clara rose before dawn and had the fire built and the coffee boiling before Elias came in from the barn. She cooked simply and well. She kept the house with a quiet, thorough efficiency that Elias noticed and said nothing about. She studied the ranch the way a general studies unfamiliar terrain, observing the patterns of the cattle, the condition of the soil, the angle of the light at different hours, the way the creek ran after a heavy rain. She was everything the letter had promised in terms of practicality, but she was also constitutionally, unshakably unwilling to be invisible. On the third morning, she rearranged the kitchen so that the east window's light fell properly across the work surface. Elias came in and stopped short in the doorway, looking at the changed room. "I moved things," Clara said, without looking up from the bread she was working. The arrangement made no sense for the light. Elias stood there for a moment. Then he walked to the counter, poured his coffee, and sat down at the table. He did not argue. He did not comment. And Clara understood, in that small and quiet moment, that underneath all that deliberate stillness, there was more room in this man than he was willing to show. She filed that observation carefully away. It was Lucy who first opened the door between them. The little girl had barely spoken since her mother's funeral. She was 6 years old now, with enormous, serious eyes and a way of moving through the house like a shadow, present everywhere and reachable nowhere. Teachers had tried, neighbors had tried. Elias loved her with a fierce and helpless devotion that expressed itself entirely through action, because words had never come easily to him, and grief had made them nearly impossible. He made sure she was warm, he made sure she was fed. He checked on her in the night without her knowing, but he could not reach her in the place where she had gone, and that inability lived in him like a wound that would not close. On her fourth night at the ranch, Clara came downstairs long after midnight and found Lucy sitting on the bottom step of the staircase in the dark. The little girl was not crying. She was simply sitting, the way children sit when the night feels too large and sleep will not come. Clara stood very still for a moment, looking at her. Then she sat down on the floor beside the staircase, opened the wooden box she had carried all the way from Missouri, and took out a bundle of colored chalk she had bought at a dry goods store 2 towns back. She said nothing. She simply picked up a piece of blue chalk and began drawing on a flat scrap of pine board she found near the fireplace. A flower first, crooked and imperfect, then another beside it. She drew slowly, unhurriedly, as though she had nowhere else to be and no expectation of anything. Lucy watched from the step.
5 minutes passed, then 10. The house breathed quietly around them both. Then, with the slowness that was almost painful to witness, Lucy climbed down from the step and lowered herself to the floor beside Clara. She sat there for a moment, looking at the chalk. Then she reached out and picked up a piece of yellow chalk, and in the corner of the board, she drew a small, lopsided sun. Clara did not react, did not exclaim or praise or make a fuss. She simply kept drawing her own flowers and let Lucy draw her sun in peace. They worked together in complete silence for nearly an hour. By the time the candle burned low, the board was covered. blue roses and yellow suns and green vines climbing the edges and small birds flying across the grain of the pine with a confidence that only a child's hand can manage. Elias had come to the doorway of the hallway sometime in the middle of it all. He stood there in the dark and watched his daughter draw, watched her small shoulders gradually unknot themselves, watched the careful, frightened tension leave her face and be replaced by something that he had not seen in 2 years: concentration, ease, the beginnings of peace. He stood there until they finished and did not move and did not make a sound. Then he went back to his room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time, because something had happened in his chest that he had not planned for and did not know what to do with. It was small and unfamiliar, and it frightened him slightly, the way warmth frightens a man who has been cold for so long that he has forgotten the difference. It was hope. October brought the first storm, and it arrived without mercy. Wind screaming down from the mountains before sunrise, temperature dropping so fast that the water in the trough beside the barn was sheeted with ice before full light. Elias rode out into it before dawn to check the south pasture and found 3 sections of fencing collapsed and 11 head of cattle scattered into the gray, howling distance. He worked through it alone all day, the way he had always worked through everything, without complaint, without asking for help, without allowing himself to acknowledge that his body had limits. He came back to the ranch house 12 hours later with ice in his beard and blood soaking through his coat from where a fence post had caught his shoulder when his horse shied hard in a gust. He came through the door planning to bandage it himself at the kitchen sink the way he had done with every injury for the past 2 years, quietly, efficiently, alone. Clara was standing at the fireplace when he walked in. She took one look at him and said, in a voice that carried no panic and no negotiation, "Sit down, Elias." "It's fine," he said. "I can see that it is not fine," she said. "Sit down." Something in the complete calm of her voice, the total absence of fear or fuss, moved him in a way that a louder demand never could have. He sat. She worked with steady, practiced hands, boiling water, cleaning the wound with a thoroughness that told him she had done this kind of thing before, threading a needle without hesitation and closing the cut with 4 small, precise stitches while he sat with his jaw clenched and the firelight moving across the walls around them. When she finished and wrapped it cleanly, she stepped back, and he said quietly, "Your father was a doctor." "He was," she said. A pause. "You never mentioned that. You never asked me a single thing about my life," she said. Not angry, not accusatory, simply true, and they both knew it. Elias looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, at this woman who had come to his ranch as an arrangement, a practical solution, a name on a letter, and he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been fair witnessed in something he would have preferred to avoid. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Clara," he said. She turned back to the fire so he would not see her face, because those 2 words, spoken in that voice, with that particular plainness, her name in his mouth like it was something he meant, had done something to her that she had not given it permission to do. 3 weeks before Christmas, he found her in the barn. She was sitting on a hay bale in the gray afternoon light, and she was crying in the way that people cry when they have held it for so long that the body simply takes over from the will, deep, shaking, graceless, honest. Elias stopped in the doorway. Every instinct he had developed over years of careful self-protection told him to back away quietly, to give her the privacy of it, to not insert himself into a moment this raw and unguarded. He stood there long enough to have that argument with himself. Then he walked across the barn and sat down beside her on the hay bale. He did not touch her. He did not speak immediately. He simply sat. After a while he asked, in the quietest voice he had ever heard from him, "What hurts?"
Clara laughed through the tears, the broken and helpless laugh of someone who finds the question both too simple and too large. "All of it," she said, and then she told him everything. Thomas and the muddy road, and the long night, and the kitchen at sunrise. The 2 years of carrying it alone, arriving here not because she wanted a life, but because she could not endure the one she had left behind. She talked until there was nothing left to say, and the gray light in the barn had gone blue with the coming evening, and Elias listened to every single word with the full and undivided attention of a man who understood from the inside out that some pain cannot be fixed, it can only be witnessed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said 2 words, "I know." Not sympathy, not advice, not the careful, distanced kindness of someone observing from the outside. Recognition, pure and simple and devastating in its accuracy, from one broken person to another, across the small space of a hay bale in a cold barn in Wyoming Territory on a gray afternoon in December of 1853. That night, after Clara and Lucy were asleep, Elias saddled his horse in the dark and rode out without a lantern. He rode 31 miles through bitter cold to the nearest settlement large enough to have a general store with storage in the back.
He returned the following evening with a battered upright piano roped to a borrowed freight wagon. One key broken, the wood scratched along the top, badly out of tune from years sitting unplayed in a back room. He got it through the ranch house door with the help of 2 bewildered ranch hands and set it against the wall beside the fireplace and stood back. Clara came in from the kitchen and stopped. She looked at the piano for a long time without moving. Then she looked at Elias. He was looking at the floor. "You said once that you missed music," he said, "that the house you grew up in always had music in it." He cleared his throat. It seemed wrong for a house to stay this quiet forever. Clara put one hand over her mouth. She stood there in the lamplight with her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes bright, and Elias stood across the room looking at the floor, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And in that silence, in the weight and texture of it, something settled between them that had no name yet, but was already undeniably real. On Christmas Eve, the snow came down across Black Creek Valley in a soft, unbroken curtain that muffled every sound and made the world feel smaller and more intimate, the way snow always does. Inside the ranch house, Clara had lit every candle she could find and set them along the window sills and the mantelpiece until the room glowed amber and warm. Lucy had spent the whole afternoon cutting paper stars and threading them from the ceiling beams on lengths of string she found in the sewing box, and they turned slowly in the heat of the fireplace, casting small spinning shadows across the walls. After supper, Clara sat down at the old piano and placed her hands on the keys. She played slowly at first, hesitantly, as though she were learning a language she had once spoken fluently and was now finding her way back to it word by word. The instrument groaned and breathed under her fingers, one key sticking with every third chord, the tone roughened by years of silence. But the music came, soft and uneven and entirely, unmistakably human. It rose up and filled every corner of that small house the way warmth fills a room that has been cold for a very long time, gradually, thoroughly, reaching into every shadow. Lucy fell asleep on the rug in front of the fire halfway through the second piece, curled on her side with one hand tucked under her cheek, her paper stars still turning slowly above her. Elias sat in the chair by the window and listened with his hands folded in his lap and his face very still. Then Clara found a hymn in the back of her memory and began to play it,
quiet and slow, an old and simple melody that had lived in the back of her mind since childhood. She did not know, could not have known, that it was the same hymn Sarah had hummed every Monday morning while she hung the laundry on the line in the early light.
Elias Boone and Clara Whitmore were married in the spring of 1854 beneath the cottonwood tree beside the ranch house, on a morning when the air smelled like new grass and the mountains were still white at the peaks, and everything in the valley was green and beginning. There was no ceremony to speak of, only a circuit preacher who passed through Black Creek every few months, and Lucy standing between them, holding a fistful of yellow wildflowers with the gravity of someone performing an important office, her brown eyes wide and serious and alive in a way that made Elias's heart feel like something that had been closed for a long time and was only now, finally, opening. The preacher said the words. Elias said yes. Clara said yes. Lucy gave Clara the flowers. That was all. That was everything. Together they built a life that was not without hardship. The frontier never permitted that, but was built on something real and tested and earned in the particular way that only things paid for with honesty and patience and the willingness to sit beside another person in their pain are ever truly earned. The ranch grew. Lucy grew louder and wilder and more herself with every passing season. People traveling the valley road learned that the Boone place was somewhere you stopped when you were weary and left feeling, for reasons you could not entirely explain, that the world was fundamentally survivable. Elias lived to 77. Clara lived to 83. They were buried side by side on the hill above the valley, on a clear blue day in a sky so wide it looked like it had been made for the occasion. On their headstone, Lucy, who had become a school teacher and a mother, and a woman who kept colored chalk in every room of her house until the end of her long life, had these words carved, nothing else. They found each other. That was enough. And it was. It had always been enough. Some people come into your life looking like a practical arrangement, like a letter sealed without feeling and mailed on a gray morning to solve a problem that was never really about logistics. And slowly, not all at once, never all at once, but slowly, through cold mornings and long storms and barn doors left open in the dark and piano music in a candle-lit room, you understand that what arrived was not what you ordered. What arrived was what you needed. Elias Boone ordered a wife. What came instead was someone who refused to disappear, who sat on the floor in the dark and drew flowers with a silent child, who stitched a wound without flinching and then told the truth without apology, who wept honestly in a cold barn and then received a piano from a man who could not say what he meant in words but would ride 31 miles through a winter night to say it another way. And Clara Whitmore traveled west expecting survival. What she found, slowly and unexpectedly, and in spite of every wall she had carefully built to prevent exactly this, was home.